and it's a great honour to talk with and interview Carol Allen Storey, who I've known for quite a few years, and I've deliberately not looked into her too detailed of her background because I know it's quite astonishing and surprising. Of all the photojournalists operating in the world, I think she is amongst the most interesting. She's the most unusual as well. She works very much as a loner a lot of the time, and I find that very fascinating because a lot of people go organised and under the auspices of charities and NGOs, and she works very much on her own, and it shows very much in the work. She manages to gain particular respect in the communities she goes into. Africa is her specialist country, and we're going to see some work by her following this conversation. She's highly awarded. The last most prestigious in Britain was when she was in the National Portrait Gallery exhibition, which is the annual portrait exhibition, and she showed a photograph there from Africa in that. Carol, what I'd like to do is go back to the beginnings, because I know you're a New Yorker, and
you studied.
Wait till you speak. You studied photography in New York, and then you came to England, to London, to St Martin's to pick up on photography. Is this correct?
No, not totally.
It's part of the story, isn't it?
Oh my God! So, I don't know if this audience is ready for the background.
Just let's do a resume, because it's very unusual for the work that you do now, and let's see how it played out.
I've only been a serious photographer doing photojournalism for the last decade, and my CV doesn't show anything before that, so I look a little bit old to be 29 or 25. Before I entered this wonderful world of photojournalism, which I'm passionate about, and particularly the work that I do, I was in the fashion and beauty industry, and I used to head up worldwide marketing for Chanel. And over a decade ago, I decided I had put enough creams in pots, and it was time to do something more serious, to really get back to the roots of things that interest me, which is gender equality and children. And my children were grown up, and it was time for me to reassess where I was in my life, and I applied to do a basic program at Central St. Martin's in photography, because I always had a passion for photography, and was able to find my way through it on the introduction, and then apply for the postgraduate program. One of my tutors is actually here tonight, and her name is Catherine Faulkner. I hope you don't mind my saying that, but Catherine, along with Graham, who was also one of my tutors, was the greatest inspiration for me to pursue the dream, which was not to be in fashion photography, but to do very serious photojournalism, the kind of photojournalism that requires an enormous amount of commitment, total passion, and a humanitarian interest. And I've been doing that, pursuing it for the last 10 years. And
tell us, what was your thesis for your MA at St Martin's? What was it on?
We did a few different things, but I think probably the one that was most directed was a very personal project. It was called In a Heartbeat, and it was all about when you're confronted with someone that is very close to you that has a health scare. And it was about my husband, and photographing him over a man that was accustomed to being always on top of his form in every way that you can possibly think, from sport through to being a CEO and all the rest. And to impose myself in his life on a day-to-day basis, to photograph and document and chronicle, from testing in hospitals and so on to the day-to-day of running the business. And that was the focus of the program that I did. But that's just
yeah, but that's really interesting. And the reason I wanted to know what you were doing for your MA thesis is to see if there was any connection with what you then went on to do. And it's exactly what you do a lot of the time when you're photographing people with AIDS and HIV illnesses, and you're close to them and you're very intimately connected. So you kind of already had a sort of
I think it's impossible to do the kind of work that I want to pursue in the tradition of W. Gene Smith, if anybody knows who he is, that have a passion about photography, is to develop and chronicle an essay. I'm an essayist. I know I'm a student of history and politics and social sciences, and I'm not a grabber of pictures. I would be absolutely horrific in throwing me into a situation saying a bomb is going off, quick, grab a picture. I'd rather get the story and the aftermath. What happened? Why were these people here? How is this affecting their lives? And so the story about AIDS in Africa, which is part of a broader, big project that I've been undertaking for the last 4 years, it's called, just as a working title, Angels at the Edge of Darkness. And it's all about women managing the agony of AIDS in Africa, alleviating the pain. It's about the orphans, and there are so many of them, that are the victims of this horrific pandemic that seems to see no end. It's been going on for more than 25 years. A few years ago, it celebrated its tarnished 25th silver anniversary, and I don't want to ever abandon these children and be able to tell their story, and these women who are so brave and so courageous, more courage than I ever have in my life. So that's it.
Tonight you're going to talk, I think, about 2 particular projects that you're involved in.
Well, I'm going to focus part of the Angels at the Edge of Darkness, which is something I've been focusing on for the last 4 years in Sub Saharan Africa, and with 3 countries in particular, because I want depth, and it's keep going back again and again, is in Tanzania, in Uganda, and in Rwanda. Rwanda is an area that I was focusing on women that were raped during the genocide war and how it has affected their life, and particularly AIDS, when rape is used as a weapon of war. In Tanzania and also in Uganda, it was more of a focus about women that have become reluctant sex workers, along with children. It's the orphans. The orphans are really Africa's tsunami, which is the story that I'm hoping to reveal today, how children that live rough, children that have been abandoned, and their quest for survival, and how local communities participate in their survival, and the strength that they give them, encouragement and inspiration to go forward in their lives.
How did you make the entry into it? So you come out of St Martin's. I'm interested in how you actually got into it, because it's quite a complicated and expensive thing to go off into these places around Africa. So what was the first move that you made?
Well, the first move, if I made a move at all, I think it was a pal of ours was a trustee at the World Wildlife Fund, and he wanted me to be engaged in what they were doing, because he says the problem is it's sort of an old charity that everyone associates with the panda, and the big focus of the work that they were undertaking at that time was to alleviate poverty, particularly amongst the outer regions, and particularly in Tanzania. And would I be interested in exploring that with them, because I had come up with some marketing ideas. And I met a woman from Tanzania who ran the program to alleviate poverty amongst children and women, and it so inspired me, the kind of work that she was doing, and it was the access that was my first entry in working. And it was a project that took it was over 2,000 miles in 2 years, which culminated in an exhibition at the Proud Gallery here in London called The Savagery and Poetry of Africa. And in the end we raised, I think it was over £25,000 over a year's time, a combination of the sale of the prints from the exhibition, along with an ongoing campaign and selling of prints online. And 100% of the proceeds of the sale of the prints went back to the charity. But it was the introduction, and I just fell in love with Africa. I mean, it either touches you in a way that you just never get enough of it. And I see far beyond what is unfortunately in the papers far too often. It's about the corruption, and it's never about the generosity of spirit, the good-naturedness, and particularly the women. The women are the most amazing, courageous souls I've ever met, and it's their story. It's their quest for survival, and what they're prepared to do. They only want the best. They don't want handouts. They want to be able to be independent. They want to be able to sustain what programs are started, so that they can make it for themselves and to pass on the skills to their children.
And when you went on that first trip, presumably it was organised, everything was organised for you, and you were working with the charity.
Well,
so
it was organised, but it ended up, I said, look, there's too many people. I can't photograph and develop the intimacy I want to develop with my subjects, and be able to really claw back and peel back layers to get to know the people. So I said, is it okay just to go with a translator? I don't speak very good Swahili. I have about 12 words, so I really did need a translator, and I needed a driver. And one of the things I didn't want to do is to show up in the big, inverted commas, NGO white four-wheel vehicles. I said, can we do something that's a little bit more reserved, a little bit smaller, and which is what we ended up doing. And as it turned out, after a while, I only had the driver with me who could help translate, and I was able to get into the communities, come back to communities, go back to schools, and they were always, every time I came back, what I would do is I'd make a small photo album. Whatever pictures I had taken, I made an album, and I would go back to the communities and I'd give them the albums and some bigger pictures for the more important chieftains and so on. And they were astonished. They said, my God, every time someone comes here and makes snaps, we never, ever get a picture back. And they were just so happy. As small things like that, which showed that I remembered. I wasn't just making an empty promise and not coming back as I promised. And I kept coming back to villages and progressing and seeing what the stories were. And
do you still do that? Do you still go to the ones that you were there from the beginning?
I do. And particularly the project that working with that I'm doing now amongst the children in Tanzania, like this last trip in Tanzania, there's a little local charity called PASADA, which is a pastoral charity that specializes in HIV/AIDS. And the gal that runs it is amazing. She's given me access introductions to people that are her volunteers. At first I was like rough riding with her people, in pickup trucks and trucks that were breaking down and all the rest. And now, and I go back, like this last trip, I was there in June, and it almost reduced me to tears, is that there's one gal who is HIV+, who's a volunteer with PASADA in their outreach program. And she knew I wanted to focus on a particular story about children that are forced to wear red badges, which I'll show you as we get into the program. And she walked every day for about 4 weeks before I arrived to all the schools that she knew that I wanted to go back to set up with the head teachers. This is not an easy thing to get access, to go into schools and photograph children that are suffering from HIV/AIDS, that are isolated and wearing red badges. And she did everything just out of the sheer knowledge that I was there trying to make a difference without any promises. I never say, look, this story is going to get published, we're going to raise X amount of money. I said, I'm not well known, I'm not famous. I'm going to try my best to provide a voice for the voiceless here. Try to encourage people that they can make a difference, a small difference, if they try. But she did all of that just out of a commitment and a relationship. She started to learn to speak English, she says. She says, because your Swahili is never going to be at the level that we can communicate. I do try a few words, but I'm really not very good at it. I'm a lousy linguist. So that kind of commitment, it just humbles me totally, the engagement.
But I think that is quite unusual for people to keep going back and keep a family relationship going with a lot of people. And also you go to so many places. Presumably you've got these scattered
it's when you say I go to a lot of places, it's within, let's say, 100-mile radius in Tanzania, the area that I go to. And I try to go back to some families that I photographed 2 years ago, 3 years ago, to see what the progression is. Is there any difference? Because I've done a story about before and after, about before people are on the antiretroviral drugs, the life-saving drugs, and then after, coming back. How are you progressing? How are you doing? How are you feeling? And so on. Women and children is an area that I've specialized in, and they're welcoming to come back. Otherwise, how do you tell a story? How do you have a beginning, a middle, and an end unless you are prepared to invest the time to go back? And it's not an inexpensive thing to do. I don't get paid for this. This is self-funded. But I believe that unless you have a few souls of us on the planet that are prepared to make some commitment, are prepared to undertake the responsibility of being able to tell a story that has credibility, that has some depth, not just going in for 2 or 3 days, you can't get the story. You can't get the trust of the people that you're photographing, I don't think.
I think it's time to look at the pictures.
You think?
Yeah. Let's start, because you can talk as we go along and explain some things, and then everybody gets a fuller picture. Okay. Then we'll do more conversation afterwards. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Sue. That was just great, and it totally relaxed me because I'm a bit nervous, everybody, which I'm usually not, but I'm really nervous tonight. So anyhow, we'll just get right into just a few stats that I think many of you will know and or may not know. Sub Saharan Africa, without question, is the epicenter of the HIV/AIDS pandemic. And almost 75% of the people that are inflicted with this live in that region. With the limited amount of news, because AIDS is not in the front pages. You know, there are things like the size of Posh Spice's boobs, or whether she's going to have a girl or a boy. What is extraordinary is that AIDS has not gone away. AIDS is growing exponentially, and it's particularly affecting women, and has an enormous impact on children and all the orphans that are left. I understand from Faye that there is a reduction in the amount of orphans that we have on an annual basis, but every one that we have is one too many, in my humble view. So let's just move on to the pictures, which is what it's really all about. This image is in Rwanda, and it's a very typical picture of what happens to a family as it is decimated by the HIV/AIDS pandemic. You end up, usually this woman here was a widow. Her husband had died about 8 months earlier from the virus. She has 3 children. One child wasn't there at the time that I was photographing, and I had been there a couple of days earlier. And the little boy that is sitting on the bed with her refused to leave her side. He was totally traumatized by having witnessed his father dying, and anyone that has seen anyone that has been AIDS affected and what they look like towards the end and how ill, they'll have a good idea of what these children are traumatized by. A few days after I had made this picture, and this is in Rwanda, she had died, and the eldest son, because I had come back, no camera, just to talk to them, because there are times you must put the camera down. It's not appropriate to have the camera up. And he said he's going to do his best to try to keep the family together, but he didn't think it was going to happen. More often than not, and far too often, I should say, is many children are born with the HIV virus because their mother has not had the opportunity of having the mother-to-child prevention drug, which is usually administered at a hospital level. Many women birth at home. This child is an orphan taken care of by a distant relative. The relative took the child to the witch doctor, which is, some are natural healers, but the witch doctor, until it reached a point where she knew very well this child was not going to recover. And it's only at that time that they finally bring the children into the hospital. This gal, the same story, you know, very typically, but the nurse at the Columbia Mines Hospital where this picture was taken also convinced her to be tested for the HIV/AIDS virus. Far too often people are frightened to take the test, principally because of the stigma that is associated with AIDS, which we'll get into in a bit later. This child, his name is Alan. I won't use all the surnames. I know the names of all of these people. He was brought to the hospital. I was there when he was brought in like an emergency situation. And 5 days later, after the drugs were administered, and where they do it is they're feeding him through his nose, and the drug is actually being fed on the side. You can see a bandage that was going in. 5 days later, this child actually recovered, which was amazing. And I went to see him on the following trip, I thought where they lived, but they had moved away. But the neighbors told me that he was robust and healthy and really looking good, and that his aunt was really taking care of him well, which pleased me to no end, to say the least. But what also happens with orphans, which is a sadness, is the children watch their parents die and some of their siblings getting sick, and they're not yet, and they feel isolated, they feel abandoned, they feel left out from the process which is a sadness in itself. At the Kalembe Mines Hospital in Uganda, they have a wonderful, really proactive program working closely with Baylor University and also with UNICEF. And their whole program, particularly for the pediatrics with HIV/AIDS, is very positive. The mothers come there freely to get the care, to get the aid. And as you can see, in this particular pediatric ward, I've been there when it's been chock-a-block, and it was dampened down. And the head of the hospital was saying is that they're getting less and less acute cases coming in because of the treatment and because of the education that they're giving to the mothers, and the mothers coming of their own free will. What happens to children that are abandoned on doorsteps? There's an orphanage in Tanzania run by some Franciscan nuns who are amazing, and they look after like 60 children. And I was there over a couple of days photographing the work that they do at the orphanage, and many of the children are HIV+. And this man had come with his daughter. His daughter is sitting down there, and he said he wanted to help, and he came back and he actually adopted that little baby. So it was a happy ending to what could have been a disastrous ending where the child would be abandoned. My witnessing a lot of positive stories. I want to show you the positive side of what can happen even with the HIV/AIDS, how the communities come together. This is in Bwera, which is in Uganda, just close to the Congolese border. And this little boy was beaten severely by his father because he was the child of his dead wife from HIV/AIDS. He's also HIV+. And this young man that is in the community felt so sorry for him, and the lack of care and the abandonment, and he can't speak, he can't hear this young child, that he has adopted him. He's looking after him. He has virtually no money at all, but he says, how can I abandon a child that is so desperate, that so needs love?
Is he single then?
He's single. Yes, he's single. And the reason he says, look, my mother died of AIDS. 2 of my brothers have died of AIDS. How can I leave a child on the street abandoned? I must look after it. It's my moral responsibility. And you left speechless when they have so little materially, yet within their hearts they have so much to give, and rewarding to see that. And typically also what happens, this is a young girl, she's 11 years of age, with her youngest sister, who's Florentine, who's just 6 months old. Their mother died 2 days before I knew the mother, and there are 4 daughters. And typically, the eldest of the 4 will pick up the baby and assuming, the role of being the mother. Sadly, all 4 of the daughters are HIV+, and they're being treated and being looked after by their aunt, who has taken on the awesome responsibility of not only looking after her own progeny, but also taking on the responsibility and the financial burden of these younger children. And there's another story, the same. This woman is in Rwanda. She's absolutely stunning. And she had lost her story about the rape during the genocide, and losing her entire family can leave you breathless. But again, a baby is abandoned in the community. The mother had died of AIDS. The father had run away. She adopts the child. And she says, how could I leave the child alone? I can't. This little boy's name is Samson, and he's very special to me, principally because on my first trip I encountered him. He would hang out with one little family that I was photographing over a period of time that started a local association. And after I had spun out, yes, I'm using film, and as you can tell, it's not a digital project. I had taken out a roll of film, and he asked me if he can have the little Kodak box. I said, with pleasure. I give it to him, and typically in African style, nothing is wasted in Africa, and I mean absolutely nothing. He came back and he had constructed a car with wheels that were made out of discarded water bottle caps and some twigs. By the end of this trip, and I have a lot of pictures of him, he had developed trains and garages, and then he would have the top open, and you have little rocks and the games that he would play. Age 4 years, not in school, didn't have, the family that he sort of hangs around doesn't have the financial resources to be able to get him just the basic things to go to school, which is a tragedy. total tragedy. A little girl in a community where one of my assistants, this woman, Mary Lima, that's been helping me with the access, she has a community that she said there are 43 orphans, and this little girl is one of them that she now looks after. And it was her birthday. And you can see all dressed up in this wonderful dress with these wonderful shoes, age 4, amidst this rubble. But still, the idea of celebration is still there. All the neighbors got together, the children were singing and having a really good time. So, you know, amidst the misery, there are the joys, there are the celebrations, which is the positive side. In a small fishing village called Karamungu, which is on the Congolese border on the Ugandan side, it's a big fishing industry there. But the biggest problem with the Lake District is the amount of AIDS. And in most of the villages, it's estimated, the women say, you know, they say, well, half of us are HIV positive. And I said, well, doesn't stigma affect you? She says, how can anything affect us? We're all in this sinking AIDS boat. Like, get real, Carol. Do you know what's going on amongst our life? And the orphans there. It is an endless amount of orphans that live there. These 3 children in one of the villages along Lake Edward, when I met them, they just would cling to each other. The eldest girl suffers from epilepsy. She's 11 years of age. She's been living rough since she's five years old. She says sometimes she gets a home that she can go into because they're going to give her some food. She says, but then men want to touch me in a way that I don't want to be touched. So they're getting sexually abused. The littlest one that says, just leaning against her, his name is Kabungo, and he's been living rough since he's 2. And because he hasn't had the nurturing of a parent, he can't speak, even in the local language. There's no one to teach him anything. And he just sort of hangs out in this little, it's a dirt village, it's a very population, 3,000, so it's a tiny village, but he's living rough. And the last boy, he's 7 years old, and he's developed a street smart, you know, sense about tough and the way he's going to survive and what he needs to do to steal, to have food, to have this. And I'd come back, I had photographed these 3 kids over about a period of 10 days in and out at this village. And the last day I was there, he had disappeared, and he was wearing this torn orange jumpsuit that was ripped in the crotch where he would hold it together so his genitals wouldn't show. And all of a sudden he comes back, he's completely clean, he's wearing fresh clothes, and he said, you're going to take me home with you, aren't you? I wanted to get clean. And you just stand there and you don't know what to say. And the local community, unfortunately, there's very few AIDS agencies in this particular area. Again, you know, this little girl, her parents had died of HIV/AIDS, and she, about 3 weeks after I photographed her, she was just wandering around in this village like that. And you know, I was asking people, I said, well, what's happened? Well, her mother died, whatever. The aunt that was looking after her has also gotten sick, so just there.
But when I read stories about families like this or an orphan like that, you quite often read that the families in the village, the community is so tight that the family brings the children into the house. Is that not what's happening here? Well,
in some places it happens, and in others, because the burden is so great. In this particular fishing village, you know, poverty is endemic. In fact, it's the profanity of poverty actually exacerbates what is happening with the HIV/AIDS. The women there that have become what I call reluctant sex workers, which I'm developing another story, they say, you know, it's not something we want to do. You know, satisfy a man, you satisfy your hunger. They can barely feed their own family, let one more. And the kids drift around. But this particular child, they were very frightened of, because her skin disorder, which is one of the opportunistic skin disorders that is associated with AIDS, was acute, and without anyone that's having dinner after, they didn't want to touch her because they were afraid that they were going to contaminate themselves, and they just didn't. But it was acute. You know, you can see that she is suffering from malnutrition, and the AIDS virus has ravished her body, and no access to any kind of medical care. This is a pretty remote village, virtually about a half a kilometer from the Congolese border, and just no support. Everybody there really just had so little, and they're trying with some of the orphans, but it was impossible. So they told me. So where am I going? What it struck me as I was continuing the stories about orphans is what Africa is actually developing, what I call, it's a new tribe. It's a whole birthing of a new tribe composed mostly of children that have been abandoned, that have run away, that are ex-soldiers, that are HIV orphans, that have been abused by some parents, particularly some of the boys were telling me that their father beats them all the time because their mother has died of HIV/AIDS, and they have to assign blame to someone, so they blame it on the children. In Kasese in Uganda, there's a bunch of street boys that have, in fact, there's 3 different gangs there, but this is the youngest one. There's about 17, 18 of them, and they're feral in some degree because, again, when they talk to each other, I asked my fixer, my interpreter, I said, what are they saying? What are they talking about? And he looked at me, he says, they're grunting, Carol. You know, they have such a limited vocabulary. They don't go to school. They're not getting nurturing. They're not educated. But they have formed a tribe. The eldest of this group, his name is Fayad. He's 14. But most of the children range in age from 7 to 11 years of age. And the skills that they have developed is absolutely extraordinary. The young baby that this boy is holding is the 6-year-old baby of a dying sex worker. I understand from my fixers she did die, and they've adopted the baby into their day-to-day life. The baby has become an important member of the Dustbin tribe.
So when you said skills, you mean parenting skills? They've become, they've just developed these parenting skills.
They've developed survival skills, an instinct of survival. I need to be alive. How can I be alive? I need to feed myself, so I scavenge for food, like animals. They scavenge in I mean, I think to myself, there's this a dumpster that you'll see a picture of in this very poor community. What are they going to find in this dumpster when the community themselves are throwing virtually nothing away? They scavenge, what they do is they scavenge for food. Their big center of attention, the big focus of their day is eating, scavenging, drugs, and as they get older, gambling, to alleviate their boredom. When you interview them, and all of them have the most amazing stories, they tell you, I want to go to school. I want to learn a trade. I want to be able to progress my life. Do you think I want to live like this? Do you think this is how I want my life to be? I want to be normal. I want to be like the other children that can go to school, that can have a meal, even if it's only one, that they have a mother that's going to hug them. And, you know, you listen to the stories, and they're babies. You know, I'm a mother, I have children, I have grandchildren. And I think to myself, my God, how can this be going on in the 21st century? How can we still have this kind of situation where poverty is rampant, where there seems to be no hope and no future for children like this, but we'll come to that. So what they do during the day is basically they hang out together. I mean, it's just sleep. This is how they sleep. They sleep rough. They use corrugated boxes that they collect. They use it to cover. One of the biggest things that frightened these children, the boys, they got to really know me very well, and they got very comfortable with me being around. I guess I'm sort of like a motherly figure to some of them, or a grandmother, I don't know. And one of the youngest boys said to me, I have to tell you a secret. And I said, oh, you know, what's the secret? And he said, well, what really frightens him is going to sleep at night, because there are times the older boys, well, they try to sodomize me. And you kind of, you know, look, and I said, and I asked my interpreter, I said, my understand, did you translate that precisely? Because, he's speaking in the local Bantu language. He says, that's exactly what he's saying. And it's one of the great fears of these younger boys who are sleeping rough, that the older boys will sodomize them, which is unspeakable. So this is what their day is like. They get up, and mostly this is where they sleep. This is how they sleep. They pass this little baby around all the time, but that's their day. There's nothing to alleviate the boredom. And then there are drugs, and drugs are freely available. They're not shooting it up in the arm, but they've got hash, they've got coke, and they roll it together, and they are chewing the ganja. And it's from the time they get up in the morning, before they even start to scavenge for the food, that they're on the drugs, and they're high. And I said to one of the older boys, Fayad, who is the leader of the pack, I said, well, don't you, why? What about doing this or doing that? And he said, why not? He says, once I have the drugs, it relaxes me. I don't have anything else. Most of the time we go hungry. We can barely find enough food. So this is one of the things that alleviates the hunger, alleviates the boredom, alleviates our day-to-day misery.
You're talking about a gang here that you said there were 17 or 18 people in this kind of little clan.
Yeah.
And then there's two other gangs you mentioned.
Well, there's two other. These are the younger ones. They're called locally the Dustbin boys. I'm calling them tribes, but the Dustbin boys. There's a little older group that's called the Ghetto Gang, and they are really between the ages of 14 to 18, up to 20 now. In fact, two of them now got married. My last trip when I was there, they got married and they have a child. Their children themselves. They can't be responsible. They have no skills at all. One of them said, I would love to be a mechanic, but I can't go to school. I can't do this. I can't do that. So they have breakaway competitive little gangs. But this is more of a rural area. Kasese is in the Rwenzori mountain region. It's very beautiful there. Significantly different than being in Kampala, in a big city. It's a town, and it has different districts and so on. But just the same, these little tribes have formed of different age groups. They roam the back streets. They're looking for food. They steal, and they're into drugs, and they gamble, and that's their day-to-day life existence.
So what I was getting at really is there's been no intervention, because when the younger ones come in, there's been no outside intervention.
There is a bit of intervention. The problem is the children don't want to be institutionalized in any way, and there are some local associations and authorities, and there's a wonderful association that's registered here that I'll introduce to you after the presentation. The problem is there isn't enough funding.
Yeah,
it's always about the finances and the priorities. I mean, one of the charities, which will go unnamed, that's there, I went to see them. I said, look, what are you going to do to help these kids? What are you doing? And point blank, the head of the charity just looked at me and said, our remit and our focus are only for children that are in school. I said, well, if they're in school, it's not abject poverty to the way these kids. They have shoes, they have pencils, they have school books and so on. And they say, well, that's our remit. We can't look after everyone, and the children that are living rough are not our priority. And the state and the country, there is no money, not significant money to make a difference.
Yeah. No, I just wondered because
you're right. You're absolutely right. And there's some local people that are constantly that I work with. The reason some of the access that I have, but it's a huge burden, and it's exceptionally difficult for these people to be able to manage it. These kids that are living rough. This little boy here, Joachim, the one that's on the left, that's smoking. You notice there's something tied around his right foot. And that's actually a carrier bag. And when these kids get cuts or bruises, it's not like they've got access to medical care or support or a Band-Aid or anything. They take a discarded carrier bag and tie it around their ankles, tie it around whatever. And that's their makeshift first aid program that they have. And I spoke to the head of the nurses at the hospital there. I said, how do these kids survive? I mean, they're living rough, they're living open. The Rwenzori Mountains gets cold at night, and particularly in the winter. And she just looked at me and she said, their immune system is better than yours and mine because they've been living rough so long, these babies, and they are babies.
Also, this is like a tourniquet.
Exactly. I mean, you know, he just defiantly stands there smoking on a spliff, totally high. I mean, these kids are, but they want to play. They want to have a good time. I was teaching this a kid with a jerry can how to do some kickboxing, some games outside of them, just smoking and drinking and all the rest. But they're babies, and so they climb trees, and they want to have fun, and they want to laugh, and they want to have a good time. They want to be normal. That's what they're looking to do. Two of the boys, I know went for testing. UNICEF has a big program there for testing and an outreach with Baylor College, and they've been identified as HIV+, and I understand that they're getting the antiretroviral drugs to help. But, you know, what happens is it's inconsistent. They're not getting a constant dosage and being monitored. They run away. And it's impossible. You don't want to capture them. You're not going to, you know, put them into jail. But this is this dumpster that was a donation made, which is almost a joke. And that is virtually 5 meters from where they sleep, where they live every day. And so the first place they go for foraging for food in the morning is the dumpster. And then they go to people's back gardens, I use loosely, where they might have been cooking the night before to see if there's any food or crumbs or anything left on the grill. And then the back streets, whatever they can find. Here they found some corn husks that were discarded. All of this makes up for what their favorite activity is cooking. Cooking is really important. And here they have a fantastic diet of discarded chicken feet, with some other things that are almost totally unmentionable. And along with one of the things that they do is they scavenge also at the local slaughterhouse to get any kind of offal or anything that they can find to cook. And they cook twice a day with whatever they can scavenge and share it out very equally. This young boy, Joachim, he found a discarded honey jar, and it was like Pooh Bear, and just sitting there and licking his fingers and enjoying the sweetness and the nectar of the honey. One day I had gone off to a lake area that I was photographing some other orphans on a dual story, and I came back about 5:30 at night, and I know chaos had broken loose because a high-up general that was in Museveni's army that had, with renegades, had been assassinated. And these kids were dragged into jail. So I went to jail, and I spent about 7 hours. I finally got them out. But it was a very heated up evening, principally because the night before, the overzealous police had beaten to death one of the inmates trying to get some information from him because of the assassination. So it was a pretty heated up area. But I did get these kids released, and they're thrown in jail, you know, on a regular basis. They're harassed, so say, when you ask them, investigate what happens to them. And I got them out, but only because the head of the children's division there, security, that I agreed to get them to come back to be counseled and bathed. That's the other thing. They were hosing them down. And, of course, the following morning there was no way I could round any of them up. But at least I got them out of jail, so that, I thought that was a sort of good news. This is the Ghetto Gang. And this is a tough brew, and the youngest member there, the one that's standing defiantly on the right with his hands on his hips, I wouldn't want to meet him in a dark alley any day of the week. But they're older and the more sophisticated in that they're always looking to protect what few material belongings they have. This young boy, who's 14, has built a little tree house where he lives so that people won't steal his clothes from him. And they say this boy is an unfinished latrine, and his clothes are folded very neatly to the side, as you can see on the right-hand side. And he was meticulous. I really got to know him. He wanted everything to be precise. He says, you know, before my parents died of HIV/AIDS, we had a nice home. Now I have nobody. I have nothing. And he had lived in Kampala, and he kept leaving and running away, thinking that life would be better because he had no family there if he went, to the countryside. He went up country, as they say. But of course, it was worse because he didn't have anyone that he knew. And these boys were able to befriend a woman that has a small salon for hair, and they sleep there at night for some protection.
It's kind of random, isn't it? It's just luck or randomness.
It's incredible. Needless to say, in Africa, all over Africa, football is absolutely their obsession. They know every English player. They know every stat, where they learn it, how they get the information. There's no television where they live. They just get the information. So that particular day, you can see Birmingham versus Man City. It was playing at a local outdoor 1954 small television with a hanger hanging out of it with all these kids sitting around it. It was absolutely stunning. But they love football. And I met a guy that was running a whole program. He was just moved there with the United States Peace Corps. And I found out he was a coach at university for football. And I says, I've got a challenge for you. These kids have to get off drugs. These kids have to get out and start doing something that they love, which is playing football. They don't have footballs. They have rags that are sewn together, and they don't play on a pitch. So I bought the football, but the football was given to the Peace Corps guy to keep, so they weren't going to sell it off for drugs or anything else. And I said, coach them. That's what they want. They want to be coached. And once they get into the game, I mean, it's the passion, and all of a sudden their noses wrinkle up with pleasure, and you can understand they're kids. They're really just kids. But aside from the fun of football, they're into gambling. They're into playing pool at night and gambling there. And you can see the kids are really, really young. And that's when the drugs begin. There's a slaughterhouse in Kasese. The Longhorns are very big and very desirous meat. And a lot of the orphans, particularly the HIV orphans, that always have got the hunger, some of them are on the drugs, which we'll explain later what the process of taking the antiretroviral drugs are about, go to the slaughterhouse just to find pickings and waiting for some dropping that they can get, that they can actually have something to eat, something to put in their very hungry stomachs. The children also, this is in Kawi in Tanzania, they pay I think it would be $50 American dollars. It's illegal to dig sand in the river in this particular part of outside of Dar es Salaam, and they have to pay off the corruption of the police so they can dig in the river, that they earn what would be equivalent to 50 cents a day for the sand that is collected for the cement factories and for the building. This boy he looks, and they're fit. These kids are really fit, but they're young. He's 9 years old. The boy behind him is 12. And you can just tell, they're not suffering from malnutrition, but they earn virtually nothing. And yet, they're very aware of style and fashion, and, they're hipsters, and, what kind of rapping music is going on, and they know all of it, and they're incredible. But this is hard labor. They get up in the morning, the first thing they do is they go to the markets to help unload the bananas and all the things that are being sold in the market. They then go to the river at 10, and they are digging in the river. They come back and they do more digging in the river, and then they go onto the rubbish dumps where they try to collect things, not so much for food here, but this is about finding metal and bits and pieces of which they can sell off and to get a few pennies. And most of this money ends up going to drugs, the local drugs, and it's a huge trade. I mean, an 8-ounce bag of hash there will cost $5, homegrown. Not from Afghanistan, it's really homegrown.
So where do they get the money from? That's $5 US.
There's menial labor.
Yeah.
And stealing. you know, they say menial labor, but it's a combination of both what they can find, what they can sell, what they can salvage, and it's about survival. That's basically it. They have no families. Most of them are HIV, AIDS orphans. Most of them. You talk to them. My mother died of AIDS. My father died of AIDS. My sister is dead. My mother. You know, it's just a long progression. Because I've spent time, and you know, sitting with them without the camera, just trying to get their stories. You know, peeling back the layers and talking to them. And they're young. I mean, they're young. This boy is 9 years of age, and he's been on drugs. He told me, as long as he can remember. And one of the brothers in this particular tribe says, oh, he's been with us since he's 5. But amidst some of that kind of misery is this amazing guy that I met about 3 years ago. His name is Mashaka. And Mashaka is a natural healer. And he saw all the orphans that are on the street digging in the rivers and their lack of education. The sex workers there, the kids that are young as 13, 14 years old that are sex workers. And he decided to do an educational program off his own back. With some other friends, he opened up a barber shop. And that helps fund him doing programs to educate these kids on the street. And this is one of the programs. He does a warm-up session first, and then he starts to do sex education about everything from condoms, about the reproductive system, the use and the application, particularly for the sex workers. I thought it was they used a Coca-Cola bottle, and then when one of the bottles broke, they shifted over to a local drink. I think it was Fanta, but I'm not sure. It'd be a whole new advert campaign for the bottling industry, but mostly to show the kids what they can do to protect themselves, what AIDS is all about, that it is not a death sentence, that they can actually be able to protect themselves by using condoms, being able to say no. But when you talk to the sex workers there, they just very simply say, and these 3 girls are sex workers, all 3 of them are under 15. The one in the middle, as you can see, has a baby. And when I was back in June, this trip, she's had a second baby, and the other 2 have baby, and all 3 of them are HIV+. They said it's skin to skin, and nobody wants to talk about anything else. And if a man is going to give you more than $1, and you can get $5, I'd rather do skin to skin. And I'm HIV+ anyhow, so what difference does it make? But at the end, it's the younger ones. You want to capture their imagination. And this little one here, when I asked him about AIDS, more than other places I've been, he could actually tell me what AIDS was about, how you get it, what you need to protect, not to use sharp instruments. And he's only 7. So Mashaka's work amongst the orphans with no money, he has no money whatsoever. In fact, I suggested, he gave me, I gave him some pictures to use to try to write a proposal. I said, look, I can't do this. I don't know how to do this. But, if you can get some basics and use these pictures that can help you get access for people that know how to write proposals, the professional NGOs that are here, perhaps you can get some money to support and help these orphans that you're trying to pull out of the street. Not the last, but one of the things that AIDS has created is what I call the vanishing AIDS generation. Not just I, but most people. What's happening is a prime generation is disappearing from the AIDS pandemic. We're going to have less and less teachers and less doctors and nurses. But the biggest issue is what's happened is now you've got the mother of the child that's dying of AIDS who has a child. You've got grandmothers, great-grandmothers, and great-great-grandmothers that have the awesome responsibility of raising the children of their progeny that have died. It's a typical story of what's going on that is not unusual at all. In fact, this gal here that's holding the baby, she's a grandmother. The daughter has died of HIV/AIDS, and she, to be able to pay for the bills and just have food on the table, she says, so I've become a sex worker. I'm probably the only grandmother that's a sex worker that you'll ever meet. And it's not unusual. This little 13-year-old girl that's standing there breastfeeding her baby, she was raped when she's 12. That's her grandmother. Her mother died of HIV/AIDS. And so now it's the grandmother, who's not that old. I think she's in her 40s. They have children at a younger age. But still, they're living in abject poverty. And what future has this 13-year-old girl have with a 6-month-old baby. It's a baby looking after a baby, which is very typical. But this is the story of grandmothers that are now looking after their great-grandchildren and their grandchildren. And it is a horrific situation, particularly this woman. She's a grandmother of this boy, and both his parents had died of the AIDS virus, and he's severely disabled from polio. And she says, I have no money to give him treatments, and she's working as she sells charcoal cooking fuel to make a few pennies meet to at least put food on the table. They're committed, these women. I mean, she out and do it. Now, this woman, she's 96 years old, and she is now looking after her great granddaughters. There are 2 of them, and she very articulate, translated, explaining that she has watched one generation behind the other succumb to the AIDS virus. That crippling factor is awesome when you think of, if you multiply that out. And yet she takes on the responsibility very calmly, saying, I don't know where I'm going to get the money. I don't know how I'm going to support these children, but I do my best. I do my best. And that's all they can do. This is a family that I met, and I actually got to know again, in a very remote area in Uganda. It was about a 12-kilometer walk-in. It was a mother. She's 61 years of age. She's sitting there on the right with her dying son and her daughter-in-law and the young boy who was the dying man's son, and looking after him and explaining to me, you know, she already has buried 2 children. This is her 3rd child that she is burying, and now she's going to take on the responsibility of the youngest child there, who is about 7. And these children, what they witness the death and the dying of their parents, is heartbreaking to hear them, and they cry a lot. And the only alleviation of some of his pain, his name is Aman, is just a daily bath. That was a cooling, relaxing sensation for him to have a bath by his mother, like a child. And afterward, I was talking to him, and he said, what's going to become of my son? How can my mother look after all of them? And you ask, of course, nobody dies of AIDS in Africa. They die of cerebral malaria, they die of tuberculosis, they die of everything but, because it's spoken in hushed voices. The stigma of AIDS is one of the biggest reasons AIDS spreads in Africa, and everything that I've read, and we have an expert here tonight that can explain. When people associate AIDS with dying, with risky behavior as described, no one wants to be tested unless a very proactive program is there. And when people die of AIDS, the death certificate doesn't say HIV AIDS, you know, it will say very simply pneumonia, malaria, tuberculosis, heart disease, kidney failure, heart failure, anything but AIDS. This was in a cemetery in Tanzania, and I'm laughing because what this actually is I've got a few pictures of it, is a 21-year-old boy, as you can see, died age 21 of cerebral malaria, and it's a car. He loved cars, and so what his family built as the tombstone wasn't really a tombstone, but was a replica of one of the cars that he absolutely adored. I met an amazing woman. Her name is Teddy, and this was in Tanzania. I had heard that there was a woman looking after 32 orphans. I said that were, you know, all children of parents that had died of AIDS. So I said, has she started an orphanage? And they said, oh no. She is looking after all the children of her dead brothers and sisters that have died of AIDS. And she too is HIV positive, not from risky behavior, so she says, but because of looking after all her dying siblings, she acquired, because she didn't protect herself properly, she acquired the disease. And so I met her, and the youngest was 6 months old, the baby that she's holding, up to 18 years of age, living as you can see, if anyone has been to Africa, it's this tiny little mud kind of house that they just all like slept together with no blankets, nothing habitable in any way that you would say was correct. But she told me she had a dream, and the dream was she was left this piece of property about 30 miles from where they were in this very, very densely populated area in Dar, that she wants all the children to go there, that the hygiene will be better, that she will be able to feed them because she has a farm. But she doesn't have a well, she doesn't have a roof over this dilapidated building. And they go there every weekend to work the farm. They walk 32 kilometers every single weekend. So I went with them. And she just showed me the story. This is where they live in Dar. The children all work together. They go to school. They all help one another in the morning. These two actually won a scholarship. When I say one, she applied for a scholarship, and these two little ones, they're twins, a boy and a girl, are going to a local nursery school that's being paid for by a Good Samaritan. One of the boys is severely disabled, and he has a dilapidated wheelchair, as you can see. Another gal, she had the most amazing voice, and my fixer knew someone that was in the music business, so we got her into a recording studio to record some of the music, and I sent it out to some friends of mine that I know that are in the music business for the world music to see if they could do anything to help her. But in the end, when I came back, and this is up in the farm, this is a little rice paddy that she is developing, and the children, all the children work on this farm. Every one of them go there. There's no complaints. There's no shucking of responsibility. Everyone does the very best. But I came back to London, and I was telling a pal of mine who's in Barbarian, and I said, God, my heart goes out. I wish I could help these people. She says, why don't we do a fundraising day? And we did. And, you know, we were selling everything you can possibly think of, from jewelry and people donating a variety. We raised $5,000. That was the amount of money we needed to build the well, to get a roof over it, a whole host of different things that my fixer was able to help, because he's very smart and able to organize. And that's what we did. And she's now living there with most of the children. There are still a few older ones that are in school in Dar that they wanted to complete their education. But it shows you that with a little bit of effort and a little bit of a helping hand, the farm is running very, very well. The children are thriving there because she's growing all the food, and she says organically. And so they're prospering, and they are just an amazing group. So this is stitched together. I never do Photoshop. There's anyone that knows me very well. But I sort of photographed all these kids before I had left on one trip, and just stitched it together to give you an idea. The pride. I said, I'm going to make one wonderful picture of all of you together. And they all got dressed, and, you know, the attention to detail. You see them come out of these mud huts, you know, never looking disheveled. There's always this pride. It's about appearances and clean. And you say, how did they do it? I mean, they're just amazing souls. And then we have orphans that end up being the head of household. This is not an unusual phenomenon, but it's rare in that very few can actually sustain it. This young boy is only 14 years of age, and he's looking after his young nephew of 2.5, Boo, and stripped skin of a horrific skin disorder. But he was afraid to go to the local hospital for treatment, only because he said, my neighbors will know that the baby is HIV plus. They'll know that my parents, his parents died of HIV/AIDS. I said, well, what are you treating the bottom with? He says, oh, just some honey, because it alleviates the itchiness. And obviously it did not, and the baby did die. And I understand that he still refused, you know, to have any testing, to have any treatment, because of the stigma that's associated with HIV/AIDS. But this family lives very successfully. There's 5 of them. Amiri is the oldest boy on the right-hand side. They live in a banana house. And he's holding this family together, which is absolutely amazing. The young boy that particular day I was there was having a bout of malaria, but, you know, he's recovered, and they all, you know, work together. Unfortunately, the youngest ones are working in the local river, digging the sand for the building trade, and the money that they make, which is about they get 70 cents a day divided amongst the 5 of them, because 50% of the profits that they get, they have to pay to the landlord of the property. And the youngest little girl there in front, she's just 4. But they do it with, with integrity, with dignity. It's not like a burden. We do this because we need to keep together. We want to be together as a family. Another story, this young boy here, his name is Godson, and I can understand why his name is Godson. The way he expresses himself, he speaks perfect English. I mean, letter perfect, better than my New York English, explaining that his father was a professional photographer. And there are some pictures of what his father had made on the walls that are made into calendars, and that his mother was a beautiful model. And now, all of them have perished of HIV/AIDS, but he's holding the family together. And he's on a scholarship at school. The local community has chipped in so that he can carry on with the studies that he's doing. And I spoke to the school head there, and he told me he's number 1 in the class. He's just so smart and so talented. And both of his parents, they're just buried outside the house under a shaded acacia tree, he said to me. And he was preparing, his mother had died, I think, about 2 months in advance, and he said, I'm never going to have cut flowers on her grave. I'm always going to plant seasonally the flowers so that they're always growing, and there isn't death, there is a cycle, which is very different. It's the way life is. I thought for a 15-year-old boy that was a very wise statement to make.
Very poetic.
Very. And this young girl, her parents died of the HIV/AIDS virus, and she was raped, another girl that was raped at the age of 12. And that's her daughter. So it's, again, babies looking after babies. But she has the support of a local charity. In fact, her sister also severely disabled from polio. The first visit, they had this dilapidated wheelchair. And then a Good Samaritan with the Salvation Army locally was able to get a proper wheelchair for her. And they lived together with the help of the local charity, Posada, giving them counseling and support and, fixing the house so things don't break and whatever. And
I think we should perhaps end on a good note, the wheelchair, simply because we're going to bring in the audience.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And I think it's been an astonishing slideshow, really incredible. But if you don't mind, I think we should, because we want to engage with the audience. Is that okay?
Huh? The red badges. The kids with the red badges.
The red badges. We must talk about the red badges.
I'm just going to do a very quick summary. These are the kids. In Tanzania, one of the practices in school, and this is really a horrific situation, is children are forced to wear red badges sewn onto their uniforms, denoting their HIV positive status, which gives them an extraordinary sense of isolation. And it is a practice that is carried widely around the Tanzania area. I visited at least 20 schools where this practice is, and it is extraordinary. The children are not, they're isolated from the rest of the children during just regular playtime. Their sense of isolation is incredible. They go home and they tear off the red badges because they really don't want to be wearing them. And yet, they are jealous of the children that are outside playing games, which is not something that they can participate in, because the teachers tell them that they have to stay calm, that they may get sick, they'll have a falling down disease. And so they are totally isolated from the other children's, and they cry. The sadness is extraordinary. Virtually all of them have no idea why they're wearing the red badges. When you ask them, they say, I have a falling down sickness, I faint a lot, I get sick a lot. And the children during break, they are in their classrooms, but they're not being able to participate. They're not going outside to play with the other children. This was an exam taking time. And that is, there's so few smiles. The stories on some of these children, this is a 17-year-old who was able to survive a terrible bout of the HIV AIDS, but mostly they come into their homes and they say, why do I have to have this? Why am I isolated? why do I have to live like this? When is this going to end in my life? And I don't have an answer. I think is when stigma ends and there's some hope for these children not living in this kind of agony, in this kind of persecution. Deja vu of Hitler and certainly what went on during World War II. The significant difference is Hitler was looking to annihilate an entire nation of citizens, where this is just done out of ignorance. And it's the ignorance that fuels this situation of where children are totally isolated completely from their other children. And I end with Nelson Mandela's quote.
I think of all the very tragic things, that is the most tragic in a way. Although you've come.
Well,
it's a very shocking.
It is shocking.
Situation.
It is shocking, but it's about stigma, and that's only with education do we have any hope that that's going to change.
I'd like to thank you very much for that, and I think everybody appreciates it. An amazing show.
Thank you.
And I'd like to open it up to you to ask questions of Carol if you have questions. We're going to do that first. Okay, right.
Down. I don't want to sit alone up here by myself. It's very lonely.
Thanks. Okay.
Yeah.
So you're going to talk to us about the Save the Children campaign that we've
I'll
run.
introduce myself. Hi, I'm Alice Fay. I'm the HIV advisor at Save the Children. And I'm just going to say a little bit about the issues that children face in general who are affected by HIV, touching a lot on what Carol's already said, and then talk a little bit about the work that Save the Children is doing in Congo, actually quite close to where you were on the other side of the border in Uganda. So yeah, as Carol gave a few statistics at the beginning, 33 million people, as you probably all know, in the world are living with HIV, and 22.5 million of those are in Sub Saharan Africa. So massively, Sub Saharan Africa is the most affected, and there are almost 17 million orphans who have been orphaned as a result of HIV. And a lot of the issues that we see who children are affected by HIV face are the same anywhere in the world, really. And Carol's touched on loads of them. There's a couple I wanted to really draw out that are related to each other. One is disclosure. So the disclosure to a child that the child is living with HIV, and also the disclosure to the child that the child's parents are living with HIV, and the two often go hand in hand because of mother-to-child transmission of HIV. And this is something that communities, not surprisingly, find really, really difficult, and it's something that's often done in a bad way. So children are told very suddenly that, and also too late, once they're already sexually active, that they have HIV, or sometimes they're not told at all. It needs to be a very gradual process and a kind of progression of telling them. And also the issue of adherence to drugs. So children who are living with HIV should start on antiretroviral drugs as soon as they test positive. If they test positive as an infant, often that isn't what happens, but that's what should happen. And so the children will start taking the drugs before they know that they have HIV. And usually you tell a child that they have HIV, you'd start between the age of 8 and 12. So up until that age, they're taking drugs every day. They don't necessarily know why. And a lot of children kind of come to the conclusion themselves, and then when they are told in the end, actually it can be a huge relief. But again, as Carol was saying, the issue of not understanding why your parents have died, not understanding why you're taking drugs, it's a huge burden for children. And there's a boy a young man really, who I met in Congo recently, who I'll call Pierre. I give him a different name every time because every time I refer to him, because I don't use his real name. But he is 17 and he is an orphan. His parents died when he was a baby, and when he was 15 he got very sick and had to go to hospital. They did lots and lots of tests on him and eventually found that he had HIV. They told him that he had HIV. He was living with his aunt and uncle who'd taken him in after his parents had died, and so he went back to them and said, "I've got HIV," and they said, "Okay, basically we don't have any choice. We've got to let you stay with us because there's nowhere else for you to go, but actually we don't really want you to, and so here are your utensils. This is where you sit to eat. You don't eat with us anymore." And they really sort of cast him to one side, and they said also another thing, can't see any point in paying for your education because you're going to die anyway, so there's no point really investing in you. And he'd started on antiretrovirals and is doing really well, and certainly wasn't about to die. He managed to carry on with his education, so he does go to school, but he's afraid to tell his friends or his teachers that he has HIV because of the stigma. But the problem in Congo, as in many countries, is that there isn't a sustainable supply of antiretrovirals. So when they come, and you have to keep to them really religiously, because if you don't, then you start becoming resistant, and then you fall sick, and they stop working. So when the antiretrovirals arrive at the clinic calls him up on his mobile phone and they say, "You've got to come now and get them." So he has to leave. If he's in school, he just has to leave school so that he can go and get them, but he can't tell his teachers or his school friends. And one day one of his school friends was getting suspicious about why he kept suddenly leaving, and they went through his bag and they found this box of antiretrovirals, and they confronted him about it and said, do you have HIV? And he had to lie and say, actually no, I've gone to get them for somebody else. And so situations like that just are a complete nightmare. But he is doing really well, and he's been very well supported by other young people living with HIV, and he's now a very active advocate, and he's very open in helping other people living with HIV to access the support that they need. So Save the Children's just started a programme in Congo working with people living with HIV, helping orphans and vulnerable children to be able to access school and healthcare, and break down the barriers to accessing the services that they should be able to access. Also, we're looking at gender-based violence, which is one of the key drivers of HIV in DRC because of rape. And so we're working with the police and the military and looking at gender relations and things like that. I'm going to stop now so that we have time.
Thanks very much. Right, I'll let you take over now. Any questions? Okay.
Neil O'Shea, freelance journalist. I was amazed by those very good photographs and the very compelling story you told of this tragic situation there. But it's quite confusing though, because I'm aware it's not the total picture of Ugandan and Tanzanian society. I know in Tanzania and Uganda they do have a very prosperous economy where they earn billions of dollars from agriculture, from tourism and from minerals. So you have a prosperous middle class and upper class, and potentially those people are responsible for the terrible images we see here. When documenting a society, were you tempted to document other people playing a part in this poverty in Uganda and Tanzania, etc.?
When I became involved in the project, I was really focusing on orphans, the extreme cases, to see what the situation was, and just AIDS in general. It started out with where I went to Rwanda was the first place I went to, and dealing with post-genocide. What happens to women? Are they abandoned? How do they cope with their lives? Of from all the societies. And of course, many of the middle income people from Rwanda during the genocide escaped to northern Uganda and other places to avoid the butchery that had gone on. But we're focusing on AIDS and poverty. At least that's what I was doing. It's not that it exists as well, amongst the middle classes. In fact, a great pal of mine in Tanzania was telling me that one of the things that's going on now is that people are getting tested and they're getting certificates saying I'm HIV negative. But a lot of it is being counterfeited so that people can go around. The middle class, well, I'm not going to sleep with her or I'm not going to sleep with him because I've got this certificate that proves. And some of them are positive. So in the middle classes, what's happening is they're buying and selling certificates that have no value at all. I mean, when you say, did I purposely focus on the more poverty-ridden? I think it just seemed the more obvious because of the more desperateness of their stories. That doesn't, exclude, certainly in the earliest days of HIV/AIDS, when anybody talked about HIV/AIDS, it was a homosexual affliction. It had nothing to do with heterosexual behavior. And of course that was back in 1980, 1981, and I think people have a very different diagnosis, and it affects all ages, it affects all genders, and it affects all societies far too deeply than we even can imagine. But it's the ones that I focused on were the ones that have virtually no support or the most limited amount of support. And if we don't give them a voice, who else is going to? That's, for me, a moral responsibility, which I think is really important.
Also, I think because you specialise, you focus in on families and particular individuals, I think that makes it very strong. A lot of people who deal with this subject, it's a more kind of general image of what's happening. I think your value really is just going in on the specifics.
Also, there's one other important thing, is middle classes are not prepared to openly talk about this at all. I don't know what your...
Yeah, no, certainly. I think I would say, to make it quite a generalisation, but yeah, the stigma is much higher, the higher up any class system you go, actually, and that's whether you're here or anywhere. It's not talked about, and unless there are a few celebrities who will openly say I'm living with HIV, then that kind of helps a little bit. But yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah, just going on about stigma, keeps coming back to the thing. We've got a wonderful quote from Mandela there, but we know that Cecil Mbeki was in denial about that
of course.
In South Africa. Do you think that governments are, particularly Uganda and Tanzania, who tend to have more progressive governments, are changing slightly? Is it a education campaign? Instead of children working at government level as well?
As a photojournalist, my role is to peel back the layers and to get the stories. I try to be totally objective and totally apolitical. That doesn't mean I have strong feelings and I get angry, and if you read some of my personal diaries, at the end of the day, I'm fuming with anger that nothing is being done, and how can we be riddled with this horrific virus that nobody seems to care about these children that are abandoned on the streets. I think governments have different priorities, and you raised a point with all the minerals, but who's got the minerals and how many are being sold off to countries? And it's a debate that I'm not really qualified to discuss in any kind of detail. All I can do is to bring to the table the story, hopefully emotive stories that can trigger a bit of change amongst the people sitting in this room, perhaps small change to help those that need the help the most, to give the kind of support that certainly Save the Children is doing in the field, that they feel, these children, that someone's listening, that someone may be out there to help them.
Yeah, no, I think political will is absolutely key. And if you look at countries which have seen a real reduction in HIV prevalence, generally there has been a massive commitment from the government to do that. Uganda actually is one of those countries.
Very strong.
And they have really taken HIV as an issue and said, okay, we've got to tackle it. And they have made, although it's, it's still a huge issue there, they've made huge strides And Rwanda, for example, is another really good example. The government of Rwanda said, okay, we know that male circumcision reduces the risk of a man of acquiring HIV by up to 60%, between 40 and 60%. So we're going to have a mass male circumcision program. And everyone said, in the beginning, everyone said, you're absolutely crazy. And they've done it, and they have brought the prevalence down. The prevalence now is 2-point-something% in Rwanda, and I can't remember what it was before, but it was way higher than that. And so where you have political commitment to it, then it does make a difference, and where you don't, then it really doesn't. And it's very hard to gain any ground where you don't have the backing of the government. And yeah, Save the Children definitely is working on that level with the government, looking at policies and things like that. Yeah.
Anyone else? Yeah.
I'm just wondering about the street children that you photographed. All of the groups that you photographed were boys, and I was wondering, were there any groups of girls?
Very good question. Thank you for that. No, not in my experience, because that's what I also looked for. I said, are there any girls gangs? And no, what you end up having with some of the girls, the street kids or abandoned orphans, is their survival relates to their gender. And the only way they feel that they can gain anything is not being on the street scavenging for food, is selling their bodies for meager pennies, because that will put some food in their bellies. And that's what they end up, but not the kind of grouping that has been. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I actually tried to find out in the places that I've been, aren't there any street gangs with girls? Is it not, do they not hang out together? They don't. The sex workers hang out together. That's the only gangs I could find. In fact, there was a group that go back and forth on the Congolese border, in and out of the Congo to Uganda, and there are about 12 women, but they're older. They're really between the ages of, let's say, 15 to 20. Most of them were orphans, and they were all sex workers. Every one of them, dealing with the military as their major contributor to their income base. But it didn't hang out the way these boys hang out together.
Oh, so much.
Hello. I just wanted to know, in terms of when you're saying the children were adopted by African people, is it a formal process, or is it simply just taking them into their home and loving them?
From what I could garner for information, is just seeing a baby crying, they pick them up, they endear the baby, and there's no formal processing. One of the big problems that does occur, though, is that there are children who have parents that have died of the virus that had property, and because there were no wills and no formal statements, you get the land, what they call the land grab, and these kids get nothing, and they're out on the street. And it's pretty horrific. They have no legal position whatsoever, and they wouldn't even know how to, procure the legal support. But the land grab is a major problem. I mean, I don't know if you've encountered that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it happens all over the place. And that's another thing that we try to do in programs where we're supporting children and adults in coming to terms with their HIV status. We'll also do stuff on stigma, but also things on writing wills and really practical things like that, and also birth registration, because in a lot of countries, if you're not registered at birth, then you're not a legal entity, so you're not legally entitled to anything. So yeah, work like that is really crucial.
Any more questions? Yeah.
Go back to what the first two people who asked questions about, which is that basically, orphans, the majority of these children who have become orphans are because of the direct, faults of AIDS. But without governments, the governments of these countries actually putting the money into the education and the re-education of the men, you're always going to have this problem. So we can prop up and support these children, these orphans now, but they're going to be replaced by more and more and more until you actually change the education and the attitude that prevails across Africa from men towards women. Yes. And that is why we have this fucking problem of rape being used again and again. I mean, this should not be happening in the 21st century. And this is what the problem is. So it's, on the one hand, of course, it's deeply upsetting to see these little children, but that you're always going to have the orphans until something changes and you shame the government into changing their attitude about these people who they really don't care about. That, you know, they are the dispensable, the poor, they're always going to be replaced. And these little girls who are orphans are only going to grow up and they're going to be raped. And this is going to recur again and again until education becomes a crucial, tool in these countries. It's not going to change, and that is what the tragedy is. The whole of the homosexual society throughout the world altered the way that it behaved. So AIDS has decreased in the homosexual society, which is where it first came to notice, and it has only increased in the heterosexual society. And that is because of the lack of education and a lack of men having respect for their women.
Well, I would certainly not disagree with that at all. But it's not just education from a formal education. It really is, you're dealing with tribal cultures, and you have to alter the behavior of tribal cultures, whether they have 4 wives. The Archbishop of a cathedral in Uganda was preaching at this royal wedding about the responsibility of this new queen, that it's about submission, submission, submission. And I know him, and we chatted after. I said, what you're actually saying, it is really quite okay for a man to go out, sleep with whores, come back, and then tell his wife to spread her legs because it is her role, it is her duty. He says, but it is her duty. It is her duty. So, and you're talking about tribal behavior. So I don't have enough knowledge of how you go throughout Africa and the 54 or 154 Bantu tribes to say you can't take 4 wives. And if you do take 4 wives, use a condom. But you're right. But at least if you can start with the children, the babes, with their innocent minds or perhaps open minds to alter their behavior and educate and widen their horizons, perhaps.
Yeah. No, I mean, I absolutely agree with that. But I think it has to be on every level. It has to definitely be at the political level, but it also has to be at a community level, and looking at how to work with communities and look at gender relations, to look at what's going on in the communities, why that is, to work with the military, to work with the police, but then also on a policy level, for example, to make it a policy that men go with the women when they get tested as part of a prevention of mother-to-child transmission program. If you're a woman and you go and get tested and you're positive, and you go home and you say to your husband, I'm positive, what will happen often is that the husband will say, okay, you got tested first, you brought it in, therefore I'm casting you out. Absolutely. So often she won't say, I'm positive. She'll have her antiretrovirals but to prevent transmission to the child, but she won't take them because she doesn't want him to see that she's taking them. And this is the kind of scenario that happens again and again and again. And if he went with her in the first place, it's still not easy at all, because there's still a whole load of issues that they have to confront. But at least they're supported together. You have couple counselling. They can find out together that they're positive, if they are both positive, and it's just it's still not easy, but it's a better way to go about it. And if we can have policies like that, then that's going to help on a community level, and we're also doing community level work.
Oh, there's somebody at the back first here.
Mine was a question about the reticence to talk about the disease. If there's such a taboo about coming to terms with the disease that the individuals actually have, how do you obtain the statistics? I mean, is there a problem with presenting accurate statistics to the governments involved to try and get legislation into place? if everything's going down as pneumonia.
We'll both talk to this. About a year and a half ago, this gal that runs this charity in Tanzania, Pisada, her name is Mary Ash, and she wouldn't mind my saying this at all, but she's one anarchist of a woman who doesn't mess around. And I was saying, well, you know, the reduction, this is happening, that's happening. She just looked at me blankly and she said, here's the stat I want you to remember, irrespective of what you read from UNAID and US this and whatever. My experience, and I've been dealing with AIDS for over 20 years, is it's only 5% of the population that has actually been tested with AIDS. So when you talk about there's a reduction in AIDS incidence, there's this, she says it's amongst this audience of only the 5% that have said, right, I want to be tested, because most people will not go for testing unless there is a severe situation medically that they think there's something wrong with them. Voluntary testing occurs best, as we both know and have experienced, is when there is a very proactive program, local community in combination with local government agencies and so on, which I saw particularly in Uganda with Baylor College, UNICEF, doing outreach programs and doing testing, and everyone came for the testing in the smallest villages. It was wonderful. I mean, it was just fantastic for me to see people voluntarily come there. And so one guy with a herd of goats, he comes in and he's ready to be tested as well, because they made it accessible, where they can actually, they're going into the villages, they're not waiting for the villages. Because most people can't afford the bus fare to go from point A to point B. You know, the stats, they're all, I'm no expert. Speak to the expert. It's just what I hear.
Yeah, I would say there is still a huge proportion of people living with HIV that don't know they have it, but that proportion has decreased a lot since people have seen people living with HIV go on to antiretrovirals and live a longer and healthy life and come back from being really sick to actually being fine again, and I think that has had a really big impact. And so people are starting to think now, actually, if I have HIV, then I can go on treatment. I mean, there's a lot of people who still don't think that, and there are all kinds of misconceptions and myths and things that still abound, but antiretrovirals have made a huge difference.
Absolutely.
Because people understand that they can live a relatively normal lifespan now. And so, and there've been, you know, huge pushes for testing, and I think there's just been a lot more resources put into testing over the last kind of couple of years. So yeah, but there are still places like Congo, for example, where it's actually really difficult to go and get tested because, you know, they might have run out of test kits, or you know, you have to travel a long distance or whatever.
It seems like part of the problem for the whole continent, if you see it as a whole, is that it's broken, it's fragmented. There are these little pockets and patches of things that are working. There's no coalescence with it. It needs kind of some kind of overall project that would bring the whole thing together of all these successful enterprises.
We wish.
That's an idealistic thing to say, but it's just it just seems so unfair. You're talking about the Uganda gangs, and then on the other hand, you're talking about how Uganda is so rich, of course, and how things are happening really well there. But there are also these terrible things happening. It's
yeah, and again, it does come down to political.
Yes,
commitment.
exactly. Somebody at the back there. Yeah.
I'm from Zambia, and I think it's very important to remember that governments are pushing. I've just come back from home, and you have signs everywhere. The red badge, it's everywhere. Everyone knows what HIV is. As far as the stigma goes, that exists everywhere in the world. Even today, if someone goes to a clinic here and they ask you, oh, would you like to be tested for AIDS? There's always a fear within anyone. So it's important to remember that the fear doesn't, the stigma, when you talk about stigma, I think that's very important. But that supersedes Africa. It goes beyond the borders.
Oh, we agree. Absolutely.
And education, as far as education goes, I also agree with that. Because, again, education is widely available in schools, those who have access to schools. But you have to remember, again, the abject poverty that people go through. So as far as education goes, yes, you have it, you know how you're going to get it, but because you don't have the resources, you're left with nothing, no choice. And it's about creating that choice. So, yeah, I just thought it's important to remember that.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I think that is a really, really important point. And I know people here in London living with HIV who experience exactly the same kinds of levels of stigma that we come across Africa. And yeah, you know, and I completely agree with you about education and access to education. And you know, it isn't always a choice for people. So I totally agree with everything you said.
Oh, sorry, I think you've got the mic at the back, yes. I'll come to you next.
Hi, Carol. Thanks for the amazing photography. Can I ask about the red badges?
Yeah.
And those awful pictures you showed of those children who couldn't play outside at school. Can I ask, what work is being done on the ground there to try to persuade those education institutions to stop that segregation? And how much of that work is being led locally by people from the area rather than people coming in from outside? Because in my experience of working with AIDS and AIDS orphans in South Africa, South Africans are very cynical about Western solutions and want to find their own solutions. And I'm just curious to see if that's something you experienced, and hopeful that there's work going on that's rooted in the local community there to change that.
My experience, and it's about 25 schools, the teachers, there's two things. One, they lament that they themselves don't have any education about HIV/AIDS that they can articulate and communicate to their students, and there's nothing incorporated in the syllabus. Many of the children are isolated, and the parents want them to be isolated because they're sick, and they may not be well enough to participate in what school activities are. It's not just the games. Children in Tanzania and in many African schools, they participate in the upkeep of the school. They sweep the floors, they sweep the grounds, they clean things. And this physical activity may be too harsh for them to participate. So the parents say if they're wearing the red badges, that at least protects them from any kind of exposure to something that would make them ill or faint or whatever thing that may trigger off what their sicknesses are. So it's almost as if they're partners in crime, if you will, with what is going on in terms of the isolation and the enforcement of the red badges of courage, as I call them. There is nothing, the local communities are not doing anything to alleviate it. The only thing that I see is in this local charity called Posada, where they do in their child counseling classes of children that are actually aware that they're HIV positive and are on the antiretroviral drugs. If they don't want to wear those red badges, they tear them off. They get sewn on again, but they are torn off. And that's my only experience. That doesn't mean I have all the information. I do not. But it's at least 20 schools that I have spent the last couple of years time in, and nothing from the local community.
Is this happening in other countries, or is it localised there?
I don't know. It's the only thing
I've never come across it. It's the first time I've come across it. No. Also because a lot of children wouldn't know their HIV status. If they did, they wouldn't tell the teacher. And so I think it is quite unusual. It's very interesting.
But it's the red badges. It's almost like a military epaulette that these kids wear. It's sewn right on their shoulder, and they hate it. They really, really hate it. And it's a blazoned kind of badge. It's not something that's sort of insignificant and subtle. There's nothing subtle about this red badge. And the children are really stigmatized by other children. They're teased. One little girl says, I'm always called the ambulance girl because I'm falling ill. Or, we're known as the sick boys, and we're tired of being called names. So it's not just the isolation of wearing the red badges. It's also the behavior of the other children to these children. And they don't know why they're wearing. When you ask these children, why are you wearing this red badge? I'm sick. Do you know why you're sick? I have a falling down disease. I faint. I don't know. A few may know. But most have absolutely no idea why they're wearing the red badges, just that they're sick.
I think you're next, not you, on the second row. Last question? Okay.
Hi, thanks. I'd just like to introduce myself. My name is Nicole, and I would like to thank you for your beautiful photos, or beautiful, I don't know if that's the right word, but like, they touched me, especially because I filmed my own documentary in Mozambique. I filmed exactly the same kind of gang, like your ghetto gang. And it was interesting when you said that they actually don't want to live on the street, like they do want to have an education and stuff. What I found is that they choose, like they said, my parents do have HIV, so I just leave the house and I prefer living on the streets and not dealing with everything I see at home. Is that what you found as well?
Yes, very, very much so. And also the abject poverty. Poverty is not just endemic, it touches you in a way that you just cannot believe. It's breathtaking. It's the kind of poverty indescribable to a Western mind unless they actually are there. It's the actual scent of poverty. You can smell it. You can taste it in your mouth. And they run away, and they run away from the abuse. That's the other thing. The children, because the parents are living in poverty, one parent is dying or has died of the HIV/AIDS virus, the children get abused. Not abused sexually, but they get abused by getting beaten. That they have to have someone that takes the blame, someone that they can vent their anger of their dismal situation that they're in. And these kids, and you're right, they want to be normal. That's what the words that they use. We want to be normal. We want to go to school. It's a privilege to go to school.
We'll just have one quick question from you on the front row taking photographs, so it'd be great to...
Firstly, I'd like to congratulate you on such an extremely powerful body of work and the sort of the compassion you have for what you do. I'm going to ask something a little bit stupid because I've been thinking about this throughout the whole thing. Going back to the red badges. Now, prevention is obviously a good thing. So preventing the spread of HIV is obviously, key to the whole thing. By isolating the kids who have HIV, doesn't that, in a way, protect the kids who don't have it by, I don't know, say on the playground, getting cut? There's a transfer, and I know it's a rare situation for that kind of transfer to happen, but it can happen. We're talking about the mother who took in the orphans of all her sort of family somehow getting HIV, but she said not sexually, so it was transferred in another way. Could the red badges, if we look at it from the other side, not be a preventative sort of measure which might actually do some good? I personally think it's horrendous, but I think there might be a reason behind it, and perhaps it seems a little bit crude to us culturally or whatever, but I think it's maybe food for thought.
I don't have enough, I have some knowledge, obviously, to address the medical side. The only quick question I can say is, another question you have to ask is there not another method? Do we have to tag these children with epaulets of red that they despise? Is there not a kinder way to deal with whatever problems that might be associated with the HIV/AIDS virus, rather than this enormous stigmatization and the sense of isolation? These are children. It's against the Convention of Children's Rights guaranteed in the United Nations, enshrined in some way. And for me, it's an enormous compromise of their rights.
And also, HIV is exceptionally fragile as a virus once it's outside the body. And so, actually, blood-to-blood contact, you'd have to have a lot of blood for it to be transmitted that way. And as you said, it does happen, and it can happen on occasions when you're caring for someone, but you have to have an open wound and they have to have an open wound. It's very, very rare. If it does happen, if you are exposed, then there's also post-exposure prophylaxis which you can take, which means that you then won't get HIV. And there was another point that I was going to make, and I can't remember what it was. It was a good one.
It's also, again, about ignorance, isn't it?
Yeah.
About this is the other problem.
Oh, no, I know what it was, actually. I'm going to come back. Yeah, one time I was in Uganda, And I heard a story of a child who was told that he had HIV when he was too young. And this is why, in fact, in Uganda, they have a national guideline that children should be 12, and they're quite specific about it when they're told that they have HIV. So this child was, I don't know, 5 or 6 or something like that, was told that he had HIV and that he contracted it from his mother, completely turned against his mother, and kind of and was just very, very angry because he didn't understand it properly. But also, because he was too young to understand properly, he understood that he was going to die, and he thought, okay, I'm terrified of dying, I don't want to die on my own, I have a friend, I can die with my friend. And so he cut himself so that he had blood, and he cut his friend and then mixed the blood so that they could then die together. So things like that can happen. I mean, I think that's probably an isolated incident, but that kind of thing does happen unless there's proper education about it. And the education needs to be not isolating people, and also recognising that everyone's on a journey. People who are living with HIV now were at some stage not living with HIV, and people who are not living with HIV now may be at some stage living with HIV, and that we're all in it together, really, rather than trying to say, you know, it's you or it's us, and we've got to isolate you so that we protect everyone else. I don't think that will work.
Just a few things before we close, if you don't mind. There's a wonderful man here, Chris Jenkins. He's come all the way from Cumbria. Chris and I met about 7-8 months ago, and he is helping these boys in Kasese, the Dustbin boys, and he has. I would love for you to meet him and have a discussion, maybe a drink in the bar after, and so on. He's doing some amazing work with these kids, so they can have better than chicken bones to eat and have a place to sleep that they feel safe and they're not going to be sodomized. I'd also like to thank the Frontline Club for providing this platform and open discussion. To thank you all for coming, and particularly to thank you, Sue and Alice, for participating in this. And thank you all very much.
Well, we'd like to thank you so much.